Hello friends, today we'll be doing the most accurate real-world test of the latest Long Range Model 3 and my own Model 3 performance. We'll be measuring their efficiency at various speeds, we'll measure accelerations, we'll talk comfort, driving performance, and we'll round it all up by doing a longer road trip. If you're wondering if you should get the Long Range or the Performance model, then this review is definitely for you. Let's start by setting the benchmark in the Performance model by doing a 0 to 100 launch and see what time we get. And that's it, 3.2 seconds. This was in the fastest insane mode, by the way. In standard mode, it does it in 4.1. As you will see here in the long range, it only has standard mode, and I was able to do a 4.2 second run. That's almost identical to the standard mode in my performance model. I also have to say, driving around in standard mode in both cars, they seem incredible identical in their acceleration. Let's do a 100 to 200 run and see just how close they are to each other. The performance model is on top, and both measurements are done at the exact same place. The last part is a bit uphill, so you can probably subtract half a second from both times. Surprisingly, it isn't really until after 150 when the difference starts to show. Between 80 and 150, they're nearly identical in performance. Just have a look once again. They're really only separated by a few tenths of a second. That's quite impressive, to be honest. For everyday driving, you're not going to notice any less performance in the long range model. At least not when it comes to acceleration. In terms of handling, I have to admit that there's a noticeable difference. The performance model just handles so much better. I imagine it's due to the bigger wheels as well as the upgraded suspension. As someone that likes to drive a bit aggressively, I'm really happy I went with the performance model. That's not to say you can't drive aggressively through corners in the long range. It's just not quite as planted on the road. Also, when you're going through corners, the seats could have a bit better side support, as you're not really held firmly in place. More on that later though. I was originally going for an efficiency test driving at 150, however due to the weather conditions I had to abort. Unfortunately, the fog kept getting denser and denser, and I ultimately had to slow down as there was suddenly no more visibility. As we wait for the fog to clear up, let's take a quick look at the design differences between the two models. The most obvious difference is of course the black carbon spoiler, the 20-inch wheels, as well as the performance badge. Since my car is white, the black accents are going to stand out much more than on the grey colour. However, the only additional black accents are actually just the front lip on the front spoiler. Inside the car, the rear seats are identical. It's only the front seats that are different, where the semi-bucket seats of the performance model offer considerably better support in cornering. Having driven both cars 400 miles over the weekend, I don't feel there's any significant difference in comfort. I certainly wouldn't have a preference if I were to go on a full day's drive. I must admit this is probably the part of the test I'm most excited about. I know the long range is capable of delivering really good efficiency, so I'm excited to see how much better than the performance model it is. For this first part of our test, we'll test the consumption at 90 kph. When I did this exact test in the performance model, our consumption was 146 watt-hours per kilometre, so it will be interesting to see the difference. 31 kilometres later, and we're ready with the result, and it honestly did shock me a little. For our efficiency test at 90, we just managed to get down to 137 watt-hours per kilometre. Now, of course, that's a good result, but what's shocking to me is that my performance model is only around 5% worse. That's really quite surprising. I definitely would have expected a bigger difference, considering this is the long-range version that is supposed to be an efficiency king. Or perhaps the performance model is actually just as efficient. It's just the bigger wheels that make a difference. I guess that kind of would make sense. Let's see if the difference at 110 is similar. At 110 in my performance model, I had an average consumption of 173. If we subtract 5% from that, the long range should be around 164 watt-hours. And just as if I had planned it, the consumption in the long range is once again exactly 5% better than the performance model. I have to say that is incredibly impressive for the performance model. I really had expected differently. Let's quickly move forward to the test at 130. Once again, to compare my results in the performance model, I managed to get 210 watt-hours, which is actually quite an exponential increase in consumption from earlier. I suppose that's due to the much higher wind resistance at these speeds. This time we got 192. Interestingly enough, that's around an 8% difference. So perhaps as we go faster, the bigger the difference is going to be. I suppose we'll find out in our last test at 150. Now this is where things get really interesting. In my performance model I had quite a high consumption at 257, and here in the long range there is now a whole 13% difference in consumption. So I guess the faster you drive, the more efficient the long range is going to be. The final number for the long range is 228 against 257 in the performance. Quite a big difference this time. Very interesting. Now what better way to finish off this comparison than by doing a longer road trip in both of the cars? In order to quickly differentiate between the two, my performance model has red interior lighting, and the long range is set to green. For this test we're going on a 130 kilometers road trip, and we'll check the consumption figures at 4 different stages. Once at 32, then 60, 115, and finally at 128. We'll keep our speed at 120, unless of course there's a lower speed limit. But I think 120 makes for a good average that most people around the world can also relate to. In miles per hour that would be 75 by the way. Coming up at our first 32 kilometers mark, in the performance model, we're at 166 watt-hours per kilometre. Not too bad. But what's actually very surprising is that in the long-range model, we're nearly identical with 163. Just 3 watt-hours of difference. Crazy. I guess I've always been impressed with the consumption of my performance model. I just never knew how efficient it really was by a direct comparison. It's really difficult to find some proper real-world testing of electric cars. Most motor journalists go for a 10-minute drive and then throw out a number based on that. But it's really never anything usable. Speaking of numbers, here's our status at 60 kilometers. In the Model 3 Performance, we're at 172 watt-hours. We're still at an almost identical measurement of 168 for the long range. That's pretty incredible, that both cars are that close to each other. Going by the consumption test from earlier, there should at least be a 5% difference. Perhaps 120 is the magic number where they're identical. I guess we will have to see as we progress with our test. At 115 kilometers in, we're at 187 for the performance and 173 for the long range. It seems the gap is now slowly building between the two. Since consumption went up considerably for both, I suppose the terrain has been more elevated, and perhaps that's why the performance is starting to get a little less efficient by comparison. Having reached the end of our journey, the final figure is now 184 for the performance, and I guess the gap kept increasing as we're now at 169 for the long range. These final figures would also be more in line with our testing from earlier. I can't say why they were so close the first 60 kilometers though. We did however end up with a 9% difference overall. I think that's probably a fair number to use as the average difference between the two. So what did we learn from all this? Well, I suppose the main takeaway is that the Model 3 Performance is incredibly efficient. Much more than I thought by a direct comparison with the long range. So which is the right one for you? Well, I suppose that range and efficiency shouldn't be the primary metric, as they are both nearly identical. Realistically, you may get 40 kilometers more range in the long range, so it's not quite as exaggerated as the official stats would otherwise say. What I think it comes down to is the styling and overall package of the performance model. For me, that alone was worth paying the premium. But I think if you don't care that much about spoilers and wheels or ripping through corners, then the long range is probably the way to go. I might even suggest the rear-wheel drive long range, as not only is it plenty fast, but you also save a nice chunk of money. Plus, you'll definitely have a noticeable increase in range in that. For now though, I just want to thank you guys for watching. Drive safe out there and I'll see you in the next one.